Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Path Seminar Series. I'm Scott Moore, and I'll introduce our speaker today. So today's speaker is Professor Xinwu Qian, who comes to us from Rice University in the Houston area, actually a very beautiful campus. Yeah, so just a little bit of background on Professor Qian. He's in civil environmental engineering at Rice University. I actually first met him at the TRB annual meeting a couple years ago, and at the time he was an assistant professor at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, right?
Yes, yes.
And it was super impressive to learn all the about the research program that he built in a very short period related to electrification. I think doing things with buses um, and that was very quick after receiving his PhD at Purdue University. And I think you got your bachelor's in, is it Tongji University?
Yes, yes, it's Tongji University.
Yeah. And it's very special to have you because he was kind enough to host me uh when was it? In spring
Yep.
that
Yep.
um, I visited him in Houston and saw Rice University. You know, the president of Rice University, by the way, received his degree from our civil environmental engineering department here at Berkeley.
Yep.
So there's actually quite a few, Rice Owls, UC Berkeley connections. And Xinwu does really excellent research related to electrification, but also a lot of network science, data, mathematical research related to transportation. So really excited to have you, Xinwu.
Y-
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So I think I will get started. That's a very impressive introduction, I guess, without looking at a bio. So thank you for that. And then also thanks, Manshi, for having me here. So just stop me if my voice cut off. I'm not sure if the internet is that good or not. But it's a great honor to be here, especially past means a lot for transportation research, right? So I give a very fancy title in the talk abstract, but I was trying to make it more plain words here is let's talk about public charging infrastructure. Um, so um, well, it's a great place to talk about public charging infrastructure in California, even though we have a bump recently, and then the sale doesn't go really well back in October. But still, it's a strong momentum in terms of all the EV sales picking up, right? And then we have a strong momentum and we have a strong dedication to electric transportation because of it's a main contributor of the greenhouse gas emission. So back in starting off our previous administration in the Biden era, so there's a huge plan of rolling out a public charging infrastructure nationally. At that time, we have that EV charging summit. At the very beginning, we have a huge plan, and the saying at that time is we don't have a template, so we're going to learn as we go. So pretty much I view that as an opportunity. It's an energy transition. It's an energy transition for transportation research. And then pretty much we can learn from the past, right? How we build roads and say, can we get it right this time? So that's the motivation initially on what bring me to study public charging infrastructure. And then um, if we're talking about public charging infrastructure, right, we're doing quite a good job in the past few years. There's many charging infrastructure here and there, especially on the West Coast. We do have some desert, as you can see, there's a missing gap in the middle part of the US. But in general, we're doing very well. We're saying about 2 in 3 counties in the US actually have a charging station. Now, why this is important is because under our initial goals, right, so even though there's a pause, hopefully we're going to recover from that. But by 2030, we want to have 500K charging stations. And charging station means a lot for those people who actually have home charging, right? It's basically, it's very convenient for them, for those with private charging. But we have to recognize there's a huge amount of people who actually live in single family house, but with a detached garage, or maybe they don't have a garage. And I'm adding those who live in multi-dwelling houses. So it's essential for those without private charging. So that's basically what brings the momentum. But here are some issues, right? So if you're talking about public charging stations, there's a few things we care about. And as an engineer, you're always curious about how do they make up these rules, right? So from the Biden administration, we will say that we want to put charging station every 50 miles on the highway. And you probably want to ask, why 50 miles? Right? Why not 40? Why it's not 25? And then when it comes to commercial development charging station, we always ask those three C's. It's basically what to consider when choosing a commercial EV charging locations. The three C's, one of the C's is basically clientele. We want to serve certain dedicated passenger groups or driver groups such that we can make a profit out of it. So that's it. And people do see this is inappropriate, right? So there's a huge sprout of study looking into disparities, inequalities in terms of do people have access to public charging infrastructures. But you're going to see these things when we're talking about disparities, when we talk about inequalities, when we're talking about accessibilities, probably our understanding is still not right. So one issue down here is many of them, we see this, or I see them as one-way top-down decisions or top-down evaluations is how we perceive what should work, right? Instead of how we look at people and how they behave in the system and see this is what people need. So that is basically one of the motivating point. And of course, when talking about deploying charging stations, researchers always have a plan, right? So for transportation research, especially, all we want to do is to say, as a huge part of it is we have some existing travel demands, we build some new infrastructures, and we want to have some perfect predictions for the future in terms of how people are going to travel, how people are going to use infrastructures. And on top of that, we always think, can we have good mathematical models with behavior realism, right? And more desirable if we could have good analytical properties. So that's what we're rooting for as researchers. So from a while ago, actually, when I was still doing a PhD, we were thinking, hey, there's a classic model of how we build transportation network, right? So these things started when we built interstate highway. We started studying network equilibrium. We started talking about how to build roads. And then those things we understand, well, it can be represented as a wardrobe equilibrium, right? As a unique solution. We have some link cost subject to some demand. And we say people are going to choose a route that minimize their cost. They're selfish. Is it very easy answer when we translate the knowledge to electrification, we think about from the research world, say, well, divide those drivers. There's some EV drivers, some gasoline vehicle drivers, add some charging stations along that. Then you augment the travel cost, right? So instead of only have a travel cost, you may have a waiting cost, you may have a charging cost. And then problem solved, right? We come up with a new study, right? And then we're going to say this particular model, as we are learning from the past, is going to solve the problem. But is that really the case, right? So that's the thing. So today I want to discuss not mathematical models, but I want to discuss some empirical research. Is some thought process that put in the problem during the past few years. And these things can be very well summarized from three very interesting questions here. This is the three questions I always use to motivate the study. So consider there's three options. You don't have to answer it, but just look at them, right? So option A is you have a charging station right at the next intersections you want to charge. Okay, it's very convenient. Just go there. That's option A. The second option is there's a charging station that is actually 5 minutes away. That is at your workplace, let's say Berkeley campus. And perhaps we have some more attributes on it. It's cheaper, it's free. All right, so it sounds exciting, right? So now you're going to decide A or B, which one I'm going to choose. Then let's say C. C is there's a charging station next to your favorite grocery store, but that's 10 minutes drive away from it. Now, probably going to debate across these ABC options, but let's think about another case. Is how are you going to pump up your gasoline vehicles? Well, I don't know how many of you is going to choose option A, but I would choose option A because the next corner is a gas station. I need gas. They're going to charge it. That's it. But then if you think about this complexity across A, B, and C, let's talk about the second question. If you're going to do this on a routine base, right? And then you're going to make charging stations on a daily basis. And then along with the decisions of many others, how will you together impact the entire road network? And the third question is, now you're going to make a decision. Many others are going to make a decision. This thing happens in the transportation system, but charging is kind of special. So how will this overall activity dynamics actually propagate, actually fuse, actually melt into the entire community, right? So today, I think there's a takeaway message from today's talk is I want to highlight public charging infrastructure is very special. Okay, so it's a very complex problem if you look at the human side, but it's actually a very simple problem if you look at the routine perspective, right? So I'll provide you with some evidences of a more like empirical research and trying to answer some of these questions. I may have a very good answer for some of these questions, okay, maybe one, maybe two, or maybe three, or I may not able to answer some of them perfectly as this becomes your homework and think about it, how you're going to solve this kind of problem. All right, so with that, I have the luxury to look at a problem from very two different perspectives. So when you're talking about charging, right, and we're talking about charging stations, how people are going to use charging stations, a nature choice is to say, let's do a survey. And there's so many surveys out there, so many survey studies out there looking at how people choose charging stations. So we also did a survey, but this survey is actually led by a psychologist. So my collaborator, Dr. Thorsten Raymer, they have a very different mindset in terms of building up the survey as compared to transportation researchers. So we are able to recruit over 1K participants. So there are like 677, like 60, 70% of them actually are EV owners or plug-in hybrid EV owners. And there are still percentage of them that actually not EV users. So they never tried EV at all. So when submitting this paper, when talking about a conceptual framework, the reviewer asks us, well, we're talking about charging stations. Why do you ask those people who actually never experienced EV or never experienced charging station before? What's the point? But then I'm going to explain to you momentarily. But then with this survey, we have asked them about 90-ish questions. So it's a huge survey that actually organized into several panels, including time, when are you going to charge, location, where are you going to charge, duration, for how long. And then we also have some moderators of charging decisions, including who are the drivers, what type of vehicle do you drive, what is the situation they're going to face, right? It's amenities, what are the amenities, it's a grocery store, it's a favorite Starbucks, etc. So put all this, we have a nice survey. It's a huge survey, right? 1,000 participants, 100 questions, 90 questions. You can't analyze it directly, so we actually do a factor analysis. So this is actually a dimension reduction technique. We actually brings down the complex answers, dimensions into 8 major factors, and top of them including accessibility. You can think of them as is it convenient to access. The cost, for sure, I will ask everybody about how do you going to choose charging station? Cost. Time come into play. Number 4 is amenities. Number 5 is about past experiences and several others. Right? So that's a survey. So survey is more of a stated preference, but we also have some interesting data. Right? It's called reviewed preference data. Right? So we have trajectories. So we actually have 2 interesting groups about how they use public charging stations back in China. We don't have this in US, but we do have this in China. And there's an interesting linkage on how US surveys actually get reflected in the behavior of Chinese EV drivers. So on one, we have those data from for hire EV drivers. So they basically drive EV for profit. So you can think of this as a taxi drivers, Uber, Lyft type of drivers, and then some of them driving this for full day, right? 12 hours, 13 hours. Some of them drive these taking 2 shifts, right? So 12 hours a shift and somebody taking the night shift. But then we have a nice data that covers 100% of all the electric taxis in one of the major cities in China. And also collects the data of 425 major public charging stations over there. So we know how they're using it. And on the other side, we have private EV owners, right? So though they use EV for commuting, so you're going to expect they use EV very differently. And we actually mined 6 months of trajectories of those EV users. And then here's a plot in terms of, well, what is the gap between 2 charging events? This is 200K EVs. That's a huge penetration. And they use about 3K public charging stations across the major cities of Shanghai, China. It's very regular, right? As you can see, it's basically charged every day or every 2 days or every 3 days. And there's a strong regularity of it. So that's 2 data. So let's look at surveys first, okay? So it's a US-based survey. And one of the things we're coming from the survey is basically an issue of survey is always biased, it's not representative, it has this, that type of issue. And then we look at the survey. One of the things we're very interested in is called EV self-selection bias. So this comes up with a question. We have a question over here saying, how do you evaluate the importance of charging time to you? So everybody's going to perceive this differently. And why we cares about that is because charging time or the charging time importance is directly associated with the quality of low level of service of a public charging station. But here's the interesting thing. In the data, we observe 2 groups. There's an EV group and there's a non-EV group. But we don't have the information on if, say, non-EV users become an EV user, what's going to happen. We also don't have the information of for those EV users, if you don't own an EV, what do you look like back then? But then having this information will be super, super useful is because we can test some interesting hypotheses. So the interesting hypothesis is there, what about there's some unobserved traits on perceived charge importance? You're going to see there's some interesting studies in the literature that saying when you adopt EVs, your perceived importance of charging actually decreases, right? Because you gain more experiences with it, you know how it works, your range anxiety actually get released significantly. But there's another interesting over there. It's called self-selection bias. It's in terms of when non-EV users getting converted, become EV users, All right. So there are certain group of people that will disappear from your population. It's because those people hold strongly about charging time is so important to me. I'm not going to buy an EV anyway. All right. So using this data, we're going to build some model, correlate the residue, and we're able to do the counterfactual factual analysis. We're going to build an interesting pathway over there. So the results looks like this. So on the top, what we see here is, look at the survey, right? There's a 300-ish non-EV users, there's 600-ish EV users. If you look at the observed difference in terms of the stating, what does charging matter to you? You're going to see they have very similar responses. We're saying their initial observation, minimal difference. But if we account for this counterfactual, factual analysis, right, accounting for these self-selection bias, what we realize is for those EV users, when we map them back in terms of they don't own a EV, we're able to restore this interesting phenomenon, saying they are having a reduction in terms of the importance of charging time after adoption. And we say this actually explains 37% of the behavior among all these groups of users. That's one. And if you're addressing for that, and if you're mapping the full population in terms of what everybody owns an EV and whatever everybody don't own an EV, you compare those two things. And you compare the third block or the final block with the first block. You're going to see we're able to recover the interesting bias or the significant self-selection bias over there. Basically, we have certain group of EV users who are never, non-EV users who will never consider EV because they value charging time so much. And this accounts for roughly 63% of the actual user groups across the US, at least based on our survey. So that's huge because of what? Because one, if you just do the surveys, you've asked everybody, regardless if you talk to EV users or non-EV users, you run the risk of overestimating of future adoptions. Why? It's because there are certain users who is basically saying, regardless of charging time, I'm going to use the EV. This amount of users are already early adopters. They're going to disappear. All right. So in the future, it's going to be majority of them becomes those users that are very particular about that. That's one. And the second thing is, since there's certain group of users and it's so sticky to about the charging time, there's a huge self-selection bias. We need to actually build more public charging infrastructure than estimated. It's because the physical presence of those infrastructure is super important. Leaves them impression, right? So there's charging station here and there. And then it's going to lower zero range anxiety, but just basically having those infrastructure sitting in the community. So that's the first thing that we understand. I'm going to talk about more about the second thing later on. And the second thing, looking from the survey, is basically what do people care about in terms of public charging infrastructure? So from our survey, we have a dedicated group of users, 300 of them. We're saying, let's group of these users and say how they're different. So what we're doing is say they have a lot of attitudes and preferences. They have a lot of factors. So let's do a latent profile analysis. Based on the latent profile, we're looking at the latent space, how close they are across all these users, and figure out there are two interesting profiles. And this is basically the best fit to the data. The first profile, we call them efficiency-oriented users. They account for 67% or 76% of all the users. They prioritize cost, they prioritize accessibility, they prioritize reliability. Okay, that's very easy to understand. It's pretty much like you go to a random person on the street, you ask them, what do you care about charging infrastructure? They're going to give you the same exact answer. All right, but there's a very interesting profile too, is there are information responsive users. They only account for 24% of all the users. And we asked them, we're looking into their profiles, we're looking at the answers. We found what they cares about is co-located retail dining options. Is it on their daily routine? Do they trust in the providers? What are the situation factors, right? Am I thirsty? Am I hungry? Okay, how rushed I am, right? What is the quality of services, etc. But we put a hypothesis here, saying the profile one users is going to eventually learn and going to turn into group two users. And we're able to actually validate this from the data. So what we do is we run a logic regression, right, with odds based on the LPA profile. There's two profiles. And there's some interesting mediators, okay, in between those two groups. If you're looking into these three categories, driving purposes is going for business, it's going for community, it's going for monthly frequent users, it's going for weekly frequent users. Here's what we find. If you are a daily commuter, you are more likely to belong to profile one. So basically I ask you, if you use EVs for daily commuter, you charge at home. I ask you, you care about cost, you care about reliability, you care about access. But if you're driving this for business, think about Uber drivers, think about Lyft drivers. They use this a lot. They're going to say, I care about something else rather than cost, rather than access. That's one. And then if you also see that if you use this occasionally, frequently, on a monthly basis, on a weekly basis, you are pretty much very likely belongs to the second profile. You say they are frequent users, they care about anything else, but they don't really care that much about cost and access, right? So that's the thing. So basically, there is a learning process you can see over there based on the experiences. And one of the takeaway message here is basically they have strong preferences, right? And then if you're looking at access, if you're looking at cost, if you're looking at time, etc., you think about expanding charging stations. You think about as many as possible. But here, expanding the number of chargers based on people getting familiar with that will not lead to sustainable utilization. We're going to see that momentarily. So that's a survey. Let's look at data. All right. So here's some interesting data we get from EV users, especially for higher EV users and how they are using public charging infrastructure. If you look at the figure on the right, what I'm visualizing here is across those 400-ish public charging stations, how much visiting counts or car charging counts actually are distributed across those 400 stations. And there's a very interesting power law distribution over that. Basically saying there's like 6% of charging infrastructure actually accounts for more than 50% of the charging demand. And then there's a majority of them is 35% of the charging stations has been used less than 10 times a day. That's huge, right? It's basically saying if you put charging stations everywhere, many of them will not be used at all. But is this an indication of wasted resources? I don't know. Okay, we're going to answer. We're going to provide some answer to that later on. But from previous surveys, we already see that we do need more charging stations as a physical presence, right? Let people see it. It's useful. But then from the usage perspective, many of them will be wasted, okay, from the resource perspective. And
Xinwu,
on the other hand, so yes,
hey, Xinwu, how are you measuring when you say that 50% of charging demand is covered by 6% of public charging stations? How are you measuring demand? Is it number of sessions or is it kilowatt hours?
so we look at both charging time and visits, and then the result or the conclusion is pretty consistent. Does that make sense?
Sorry, can you repeat? You look at charging, can you repeat?
We look at both visits, total visits per charging station, and also the total charging duration per charging station. So the
Okay,
time occupied for the charging piles at that charging station. Does that make sense?
I see. Okay.
Yeah. So this is the thing. For higher EVs, usually when they go to charging station, they prefer to top up. So whenever they go there, they prefer to top up. So there's an interesting connection in between visits and the amount of time they spend there.
Okay, I see.
A question onto the same one.
Yep.
Which one is the more stronger factor? Is it the duration of the charge or the frequency of the charge? I mean the number of charge. I mean user. I mean charging. I mean the number of cars being charged. Because I could have a lot of car charging there, but for relatively shorter duration, less than half an. I mean, relatively shorter. I could have a very
Yep.
few traffic, but then
Yep.
they are probably charging for a very long time, meaning for a
Yep.
full charge of the
Mm.
car, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
which one is a stronger factor, and which
Yep.
one indicates a, a greater portion of
Mm.
population of the charging
Yeah.
EV owners?
Thank you, Roger. And I got your question. So the answer is they're very similar. So just as I explained to Scott here is here I visualize charging counts. I don't visualize charging time, but if you visualize charging time, very similar conclusion. It's because these are for higher EV users. So whenever they go to charging station, they're trying to top up. Say, I have 20% battery remaining. I will choose to charge to 80% or 90%. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so usually they don't say I charge 5 minutes and I will leave and I charge later on. So that's basically it's basically wrong against their purposes.
But how do you define 50%? Because is it, let's say, per year, the total charge required is like 200 megawatts. Of
Right, right,
that,
right.
if of that,
Got you. Mm,
uh, this 5% of the charging station is providing
got
100
you.
megawatts. So that's how
Got you.
you're saying, okay, those 10% is actually charging the 50%. Is that how you quantify that?
So we measure in two ways. So what I'm showing here is in terms of total visits. So as long as a driver go to a charging station, that's one visit, right? So we're saying for this figure, is 50% of the visits happening around 6% of charging infrastructures. That's one. And then we also basically, not showing here, but we also calculated the time they occupy charging stations over there. And then you can calculate the amount of time as a proxy of kilowatt hours. I don't have the kilowatt hour data. I understand what you're asking here. But then I'm using the time as a proxy. Then basically we see there's a super strong linear correlation between time and visits. And you get very similar answers as you see here.
So one question, does this SIP law may have to do with the nature of human mobility? In other words, you have the charging station data only of the people you interview, and people
Yes.
to visit their places with a SIP law like, then you are capturing their preferences.
Exactly. So that's what we're seeing here on the left. So actually that's a fantastic question, Martha. It's very aligned with many of the work on human mobility. So why I say this is a preference, okay, is intuitively for EV users, especially for higher EV users, they should not have a preference because they're doing this right, for business. What they're trying to do is I want to make as much money as possible. But when you're looking into how much delta time, meaning that there's a charging station nearby, but I just don't go there. I'm willing to travel extra 5 minutes, extra 10 minutes, or even extra 30 minutes, and it comes from many of them, to go to a charging station that I like. Right, so this actually happens for those electric vehicle or EV e-taxi drivers. So that's a very interesting finding over there.
Yeah.
Shall we continue?
Yeah, thanks.
Right. So this is basically counterintuitive, but it's basically super important, right? And then if you map this back into a survey results, what I just showing you, if you're talking about business users, right? There's a profile too. They care about a lot of amenities. There are places they like. They will go to those places. They will not use the arbitrary charging station over there. And how much they tolerate against that? 30 minutes for many of them. So that's huge. So, and then we're actually trying to verify this, right? We're basically saying how habits drive your decision. So there's so many things, right? If you're talking about taxi drivers, it can be access to future customers, time of day, right? Build environment, charging station attributes in terms of number of chargers, utilities, parking costs, or we can measure habits. We measure habits in terms of trying to define a radius of gyration. It's basically that's a typical places to typically go to. And then we can measure the charging station you use, okay, how far it is deviated from your comfortable zone, right? The typical areas that your activities take place. And we find this particular strong habit, the momentum, right, the inertia, actually explains about 50% of the variance of why they're making a decision. Okay, along with many others that is also important. And we do see this stay very strong in terms of a quantile regression results. 10 minutes, very negative, 15 minutes, very negative, 25 minutes, very negative. Until it is getting beyond 30 minutes, 50 minutes, now they start to become a little bit rational. Right? So that's the thing that we recovered from this one. This is what we see from the group level, right? Everybody seems like they're doing that. What about individually? So what we're able to do is to say, now let's look at this individually. So what we say is, let's try to organize the trajectories of each EV users in terms of driving activities, charging activities, right? You have this every day. You have this for the whole week. You have this for the whole month. It's more like each trajectory becomes a document, right? And then each driver has pretty much a book from those documents from different pages. So from there, we use topic model to say, well, for each of this book composed by the activities they're doing on a daily basis, how similar are the contents they're doing that over each of the pages, right? Are they repeating themselves? And then how similar are it across different taxi drivers? And what we use is we basically calculate embedding, right, from topic modeling. And then we compare the cosine similarity across embeddings. And very interesting, we see the cosine similarity is super high. It's about 0.8, it's about 0.9, it's close to 1. So we have a conclusion, it's pretty much like there's a strong inertia on the population level, but this strong inertia coming from individual repeating what their behavior is that gives you the results at the population level. So that's what we realized from the taxi drivers. Okay. What about individual users? We actually have a very similar story, and that is very interesting here. So for individual users, you can think of there are certain days they don't charge. There are certain days they charge, right? And then pretty much they mainly only go to a charging station on one of the days or two of the days of the week. And most of the days of the week is how they're doing activities across the city. And if you categorize in terms of where they participate in activities, this can be and in terms of rank 1 location, rank 2 location, rank 3 location, how much time do you spend in each of these locations, you can actually fit them very well, and it's very well understood from the human mobility study, right? It can be approximated by the z-score. So it's basically inverse proportional to the rank, okay, as in terms of the amount of time you spend, right? So that is the red bar, okay, as you're showing here. But if you look at the charging events, it's not, perhaps it's surprising, and it's not surprising that it follows a very similar trend. It's also a Zipf's law. And more importantly, it's more skewed, all right? So if you're looking into the scatter plot on the right, basically saying activity rank, top 1 location, charging rank, top 1 location, you see they align very well, okay? And then, by the way, number 1 location is usually home, right? That's very easy to understand. But then number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, there's a scaling property as well, okay? And then what we're saying here is top 10 activity locations actually covers 80% of our charging events. That's very interesting over there. And we also test the simple analysis or simple hypothesis. Are people just repeating the same mindset in terms of choosing charging stations as compared to their choosing their activity locations? So what we're doing here is to say, can we approximate the rank of charging given rank of activity as just two independent process of rank of activities time rank of activities? And we say that we can't reject the hypothesis, right? And this KS test, basically these two samples across a huge population is saying, well, there's very little hope, or this basically we have some good faith saying, well, this might actually be the case in terms of how they're choosing charging station. That's why I say it's pretty regular from that perspective. Does that make sense? Any questions here?
This is not taking into account how home, right?
So there's home. Number 1 is usually home.
Exactly, that's what I thought.
Yes.
So number 1
Number
is
1
home
is home.
because yes, okay, that was the question. I asked
Yes.
a little bit later. Thanks.
Right. But then you see number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, same ranking process. It's very similar trend. Right. Scaling valid, pretty much.
Xinwu, can you remind us in what year did you collect this survey data?
The survey data is 2024, last year. US data is 2024, last year.
Are there
But this data, as you see here in China, is, you see that again?
yeah, are there non-US residents in this data?
So for the survey data, it's all US citizens. It's all US residents. It's a geocoded across the entire US for different states.
Okay,
But the data here that we see here, trajectories, are Chinese data.
I see.
Can we continue?
Question?
Yes.
The Chinese data, is that when you collect it, is that more of the commercial data on the taxis? I don't know. I mean, in general, is it more of a private ownership there or more commercial for taxis? Because price is an issue there, price sensitive market.
Yeah. So the previous two, these two results are for commercial or business users. Okay, so they drive for profit. This one is for private EV users. So they're individual commuters.
Okay. And in terms of the behavior of private behavior usage model, the charging number of how often they charge versus the miles being driven between US and China, how do they correlate? I mean, the behavior, what I'm saying, the private user behavior or the mileage is being usage of mileage and charging pattern.
So my honest answer is I don't know very well about US landscape in terms of how actually people use EVs because I don't have access to the trajectory data. So I can't answer that.
Okay.
Right. So now in the interest of time, I'll try to quickly move this forward. So basically, I'm trying to provide you with explanation. So what happens to this unequal utilization, the scaling of those things? So actually, the theory of satisficing explains this very well. So it's when we're doing these decisions in the real world, when we're making decisions on a huge uncertainty, especially when charging decision comes into play, it's too complex for human beings, right? And then when it's too complex, we go back into our routine activity and we say, let's just grab something on our daily basis, whatever I'm comfortable with, and I'll stick with that. And you actually can compare those two. Same group of users, when they're doing non-charging activities, when you're choosing these, basically a random sample of 500 travelers. I compare with how do you choose routes, right? Is it the shortest path versus what you actually choose? You see there's an almost perfect linear relationship. And when you compare with charging, you see, is this really the shortest travel plus charging time for you? And you see there's a huge deviation. actually the deviation can be as much as 50%. So that's what we realize. Okay, so people are much more tolerant to actually the performance or the time wise in terms of charging, but there's so many other factors come into play. Right? Yes.
No, I just said,
Question?
wow. Nope.
Okay, so that's one. All right, so I was trying to connect the story a little bit more here by saying, what about we think a little bit more? This is charging infrastructure. This is user behavior. But can it go beyond just the infrastructure? So the analogy I'm making here is now I released a new iPhone this year, right? And the new iPhone 16 have so much new features. You can think about charging, right? The charging is super fast, all right? There's so many chargers that provide you best services, best pricing plan. Well, iPhone also new AI features. And they start to show off new colors. And what people remember about iPhone 16, when you're talking about that, what is it? The orange color, all right? And then what interesting happens, what is really interesting here is there's a social contagion, social diffusion process is when you see someone, let's say Man Shi in the room, bought the latest iPhone and she's using it. When you check that, it looks appealing to you. I also want to buy that new iPhone as well. It happens all the time. Now, if you think about charging infrastructure, EVs, very similar cases. We see them on a daily basis. We don't pay attention to that, but they become some trigger, some cues in our mind. Now, if there's someone charging us there, this provides you with some stronger evidence. If you see this all the time, you see the fancy EVs, you see a charging station. What about you think about, I will buy an EV as well, right? This may well happen. So this basically telling us, well, let's forget about all the well-known studies about infrastructure-driven adoptions. There could be more, right? So we did a very interesting study with 2 undergrads here in Rice. So what we do is we look into Seattle. Why do we look into Seattle? Because Seattle is the only place we could find that is able for us to thread all the data together. So what data do we look into? We look into vehicle registrations. We look into mobility flows or the visitation flows across the city. And we're looking into the public charging infrastructure and where they are, but you also bring in more factors like income, education level, etc., right, into the model. What we can measure is basically if you use the human mobility data, right, you know where they're going, and then you know where the EV registrations are. You kind of can map how many EVs or what is your exposure to EVs on a daily basis for those people. That's one. And the second is based on where you're going, right? You can measure a distance. You actually can measure what is your daily exposure in terms of charging infrastructures. That's the second thing that actually you can build over there. Now we're trying to make a hypothesis. Does visibility of charging stations and exposure to EVs actually increase EV adoptions? And when we're making this hypothesis, basically our answer is obvious, right? Yes. So what we do is we actually do a causal model, pretty much. It's not a correlation. So we test multiple causal structures across different models, and we choose a consensus model. This consensus model has multiple things, right? Like population density, bachelor degree, home values, income, etc. That actually affects the registration, that affects exposure, it can affect the EV exposure and charging exposure. But we really care about is the interesting relationship between charging exposure, EV exposure, and EV adoption. So quickly, the conclusion here is when you see EV on a daily basis, it drives total adoption with a very strong total effects. This effect is comparable with many policies, with many incentives, okay, on the scale wise. So that's like 0.153. So basically that's saying seeing EVs and everyday routines increase neighborhood adoption. We also see there's a very strong total effect for charging infrastructure exposure, that is 0.172. This actually maps back into our early studies. You need to build more charging infrastructures, right? It's basically a physical cue for you to see them. It's going to drive adoption, even though it's not going to be fully utilized. But we also see that it's mainly mediated by EV exposure. So there's non-significant direct effects from seeing charging infrastructure to EV adoption. But what happens is infrastructure serves as a contextual catalyst, okay? So basically it's amplifying the results of EV exposure by bringing EV here, let people see that. And then it's a conditional rather than additive. So what do I mean here? If you see an empty charging station, okay, even you see this station, you're gonna feel, hey, nobody's using that. That probably is a wise decision of not using EVs because it's not reliable. But now if you have stations, people started using it and you see it and they say, hey, people are having fantastic, fancy EVs. They are using the public charging infrastructures, okay? That actually motivates me to buy EVs in the future. So that's what we found from this study. Very simple study, but that makes a lot of sense. All right? And of course, a lot of effects matters, right? If you're talking about low-income household or medium-income household, then the final factors that contributes most significantly is eventually the price of EVs. No matter how many EVs you see on a daily basis, that's going to drive the adoption. Okay, or not as strongly. It still affects, but not as strongly. But if you're looking into relatively high home values, high bachelor, high education level, high income level, the huge margin in between the high versus low, it can be 3 times as high and be 4.4 times as high. Okay, that's the conclusion that we're getting from there. So pretty much you can think of this is a very interesting lever. You can think of public infrastructure as a mechanism that you can build into a system at a strategic level that can bring adoptions beyond just a direct utilization. Well, I'm almost running out of time, so I'll just talk about one more thing and I'll conclude. Right, so the final thing I was talking about here is we're at an interesting time here. A lot of things are on pause, right? But we already built a lot of charging stations. So there's about 20K, 28K public charging stations already there. There's mobility data we can use from a lot of devices across, we choose 20 US metropolitan areas, right? And you see in the literature, there's a lot of studies about equity, about disparities. And they're talking about this from accessibility perspective. What I want to highlight here is probably that's not the case. So the thing here, we're introducing something called visit-based accessibility. So it's pretty much like you continue your daily routine, right? And what is the likelihood that you encounter a charging station during your routine activities? Now, if you look at distribution across these 20 metropolitan areas, it's so different, all right? And if you visualize how it looks like spatially and link that to the income level, education level, household value, okay, they're going to look very different. So here's the conclusion. Okay, so we see there's a proximity and access paradox. So in the traditional transportation literature, access means it's close by, right? But in the modern world, when the city sprawls, when we drive, right, especially when EVs become so inexpensive in terms of driving, you can travel more miles. The distance is not only this, or becomes less of a deterministic factor. If you're looking at only distance-based measures, okay, we see there's a lot of negative values across income level. So here, negative means what? It's closer to their home in terms of charging infrastructures. So actually, we're doing pretty well in terms of national scale and where we put the charging stations. It's basically serving our so-called equity goals or equality goals, saying we want to bring this to those disadvantaged communities. They have better access. But in reality, if you're looking into from the visit-based perspective, you're going to see a completely different story. Is those people don't go there, right? If you look at median household income, well, 14 out of 20 cities tell you it's equitable. But if you're talking about visit-based, 13 of 20 of them saying, well, it's not in my daily routine. That's one. If you look at the household value, even so, right? So there's another issue why we include both median household income and housing value, is I believe housing value is more of a better indicator these days in terms of the particular community, particular group. But you see here, almost a consensus, right? Almost 19 out of 20 cities. While we have those green colors everywhere, they're all significant. It's not in my daily routine. That's one. The second thing here is access doesn't equal to effective access. What do I mean? Even if it's aligned with your daily activities, right? It's on your daily routine. But do you even have time to charge your vehicle? Right? That's a second dimension that will bring to the problem. Is if you look at how we spend time across different places, right? Food service restaurant, limited service restaurant, religious organizations like a church or hotel, right? You spend different amount of time in those locations, and this is totally different. What we realize is a compound disparity. So meaning that for many people, okay, they don't have this access on their daily routine. That's one, okay? It's not on their daily routine. And if it is on their daily routine, what they realize is the time is just not enough for you to charge there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, that's just not enough. Or even you're going to lose this because you're traveling between those routines. You still have to seek other opportunities. So that's the thing that we observe over here. All right. So that's the thing, right? So we review some due time compound disparities. Now, an obvious answer you're going to ask me, or you can't ask me, is to say, there's so many charging stations. Can we give them information, right? Can we do the pricing? Can we do better guidance? Have an app, let's say there's a plug here that tells them there is the charging station. Please go there. You can access that. But our data tells us that's probably not the case. And it's even more so than we call it an invisible barrier. And it's even worse than a physical barrier. So what do we mean? Think about you yourself, right? So where do you typically go to? You choose those activity locations you go to for a reason. There could be it's a place where it's matched my income level. That's one, right? The second thing is it's a place where I meet similar people as compared to which I encounter in my neighborhood, right? In my workplace. Okay, so I typically go to those places. Think about you're a professor from Berkeley, you're a graduate student from Berkeley, right? You want to go to the places where other people are like you actually go to. So, but there's so many places where actually those are the people that dislike us. Okay, that is a huge barrier to stop us from going. And it's real. If you look at the map here, in terms of where do people go to churches, you're gonna see it's totally segregated, right? Black people go to churches at their location. Asian people, white people, Hispanic people, they have their preferred location in terms of church and segregated. Same thing here in terms of charging. Okay, so what we do see here is, well, yes, there is a place nearby. Yes, it's very nearby, and there's nothing stopping me from going there. But I probably won't feel comfortable going here, which we call it the problem of not in my comfortable zone. And that's even more so. That's not probably not being overcome, okay, by any of the information levels or mechanism levels. Well, how hard is it bridge the gap, right? So we actually do some counterfactual studies over there. So what we do is say, well, if I switch you to some nearest POIs, right? How does it expand your daily radius of gyration? So how hard it is for you to go to another POIs that have a charging station. So we find this basically increase your distance by 2.6 kilometers. Well, it looks small, okay, it looks small, but if you put into percentile in terms of change of the typical travel distances, it can be increased to as much as 100%. So that is brutal, right? So this basically is total change of lifestyle, which is very hard to go by. If I say I buy an EV, you ask me to totally change the way I live, probably have to think about that. Okay. And the second counterfactual, what we do is to say, okay, what if we bring these people to charging station where those are the people visiting that place that are like you? And we realize if you want to do so, that's going to significantly increase the travel distances by 7.7 kilometers or at least 7.3 kilometers, depending on if we're talking about income segregation or racial segregation. So that's a conclusion over there. All right, that's pretty much it. So I will skip this, but I want to highlight just one thing. Okay, one thing is this is a routine, right? There's social barrier, but how we practice our routine, how we put our infrastructure have a ripple effect. That is basically, we want to do something. When we're trying to do something, there's a business components coming to that. And then it has something to impact the business dependencies. We do a simple testing. This is still ongoing work. We're going to publish this soon. But we realize there's an echo chamber in California. What we're saying is there's exclusive dependency between brands of high charging station coverage. So if you go to somewhere with a very high charging station coverage, then very likely for other activities, you're going to be more attached to other brands that also have a very high charging infrastructure coverage. Okay, at least among certain groups. Right, I'll skip all these and I will jump to my conclusions. So there's some modeling studies, and then here's a V2G thing probably Scott will be interested in. I'll send the paper to your way. So conclusion here, public charging infrastructure is special. So I bring this at the beginning. So I will try to reinforce this. Hopefully I sell a story and there's something nice for you to think about. Human society-wise, it's really complex, but routine is actually simple. But addressing this routine, simple thing is actually very challenging. There's a lot of difficulties from the social perspective. And there's a lot of work on EV charging, but still a lot of more work to do in this space, right? So 3 figures to wrap up. The first, there's a huge population, all right? And then there's only a small population that we actually use EV users. And then among those EV users, there's even a small fraction of them actually use public charging infrastructure, or at least on a regular basis. So hopefully today's talk provides you with some interesting evidence, which allows you to distill this little information, mapping back to the broader community and say, what if mass adoption comes to us, okay? And how do we prepare for us with those insights? That's number 1. Number 2, charging is easy, charging is hard. So if you think about going from point A to B with a gasoline vehicle, the decision is super straightforward. You open a Google map, there's a route, shortest path, I go there. But when you factor in charging, there's the options, there's amenities, there's how can I effectively leverage off my time during charging. This becomes super complicated. Once it becomes overwhelmingly complicated, I seek simple answers, which basically is the static spacing or the inertia that drives a long way. Final thing, this is the history. When we build interstate highways, we create a lot of segregations. And we intendedly or unintendedly create a lot of segregations, which actually becomes the integral part of our urban cities. And then charging station is pretty much adding upon that. It's basically a topping on top of a cake. And in terms of that, are we solving the problem? What are the remaining problems that is basically from the history that is challenging us? And what can we do to pretty much overcome all these barriers? All right. So acknowledgement. I'm fortunate to work with fantastic students and fantastic collaborators. They're from very diverse backgrounds: social science, cognitive science, there's engineering. And then we put together all this work. And also thank ChatGPT for providing me with some interesting figures. And then this work is supported by NSF grant. So here are some references I talk about today. So we did a series of studies looking into different aspects of charging, but pretty much that's condensed into this 40 minutes talk. With that, thank you for having me here.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. We will maybe spend 5 more minutes for questions. Any question? Marta. Marta?
Yes, thank you so much. I thought instead of teaching my class, I should have sent my students to this lecture because many have EV projects and we cover a lot of the human mobility metrics. Thank you. I enjoyed this very much.
Thank you, Marta.
I wanted it in my class. If you go to slide 27.
27. This one.
No, maybe. No, the counterfactual number 2. Yes, here. Yes.
Here.
How do you do this counterfactual number? Tell me about how you do the counterfactuals again.
So we actually have an online manuscript. You can check that. But simply put, so in a city, so we divide people into 2 groups. So those actually have good access and those who don't have good access, so below medium. So we do those for those people below the medium. And what we do is to search from the most promising solution, we rank them. So it's kind of a very heuristic way. We rank them, saying this is going to bridge the most of the gap. And then I'm going to find across all the alternatives, how can I bring you to a place which you're going to feel comfortable with, based on the typical place you encounter on a daily basis. And then who actually goes to that place. So there's a match in between those distribution. So we're trying to find that. And we do this iteratively. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Xinwu, I have a question. So you mentioned about this detour for charging, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
So I was thinking about okay, so let's say a person needs to charge once every 3 days, right?
Yes.
So how to build this charging routine as well as the time and location it spends into this whole trajectory in this spatial temporal diagram in a way that differs from the original routine in the spatial temporal diagram in the minimum way. So however, people's schedule do have a lot of flexibility. So for example, I need to charge right now. I could do my shopping today, or I could do my shopping 3 days later. But because I charge, I will go to the supermarket and do the charge.
Absolutely.
This kind of swapping of events, activities, changing of driving behavior. But with flexibility, do you count that as detour or not?
So first thing first, the detour goes to the commercial drivers. So it's Uber drivers, it's taxi drivers. So the way we want to highlight detour is to say it's counterintuitive, right? They should not do that, but they're actually doing that. That's one.
However, I think for even in China for taxi, aren't they doing the swapping?
Well, no. Initially, yes, but no longer.
Oh, okay, sure.
Professor Qian, thank you. This was a great presentation. I have a question surrounding your research more broadly. So something that we've seen in previous literature based on surveys from like Sylvia He and Guerra and Danziano and Corey Harper is actually the importance of where people live regarding their charging habits. So do
Yes,
they have the ability to charge at home? Do they have a parking
right.
spot to charge at? Or do they live in an area, they are using street parking or using communal parking to charge? And I
Yes,
was wondering, throughout your studies, you touched upon some of these topics at different points, and I was wondering if there's any insight to
yes.
actually ramifications of where people live regarding
Mhm.
their charge.
Right. So, where people live regarding their charging actually is very important. Let's think about this case. It's this case. If we have a wide spread of charging stations that is already available, and everybody is already adopting EVs, then yes, where people live actually matters a lot. And that's where I think the issues with surveys are, is you are always asking people of something they don't have experience with. And they're giving you some answers. They say, this is data-driven survey, right? There's always a bias. So they believe that's the case, but it's going to be always different from what the data tells us. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, right. So what we find, for instance, in this study, is when we're looking into their daily routines, right? So one of the reviewers actually asked this question. So what about they can charge overnight? Where there's a charging station nearby their home, and then what about they're going that? And they solve all the issues. But we realize is for those nearby their home, it's similar. They don't go there. So it's basically the issue as if, do you really go to a place nearby your home or not? Okay, and where it is located. Okay, it's a strategic decision. And then if you don't go this on daily routine, are you going to even do this during the night? Well, me, I'm not going to do that. So I don't know about what others, even though we can answer the survey in that way. But I don't think that is really representative behavior of the general population.
And,
That's
and
my
this
take.
and this is a finding from your paper that's currently under review.
Yes, but we have the preprint online, so feel free to look into that.
I definitely will. Thank you.
Yep. Yep.
I think there is also an issue of capacity, right? So maybe people say they don't go there because there is only one spot.
Yes, yes.
And yeah, they know that they wouldn't get it.
Right. So we actually cover all this in our survey. So what do people care, right? But then that's another issue is we're at the early stage, right? We're at the early stage. We're saying how can these things stepping on each other and motivate the adoption of EVs. But later on, when everything really matures, for instance, in California, I think it's already at a very interesting level of adoptions. Then we're talking about all these operations and management, etc. But that's a real issue.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so let's thank our speaker again, and thanks for this wonderful and great talk.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Xinwu.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Manshi. Thanks, everyone.